look at it this way. There's an understanding in among those who manage the capitalist system. There's an understanding that one of the ways that inequality continues to be reproduced over generations is that there's a large belt of countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America. It just seems to be these places, a large belt of countries which had formerly been colonized, where the workers in these countries are being paid subhuman wages. See, and this subhuman wage is justified on cultural grounds. So we are told, for instance, in Zambia, standard of living is low. If the standard of living is low, then you can pay people very little to pull the copper out of the ground. Now, you and I cannot be holding this conversation right now without that Zambian miner. That Zambian miner went into the ground, brought out that copper. That copper was then processed into wires, into small components for our computers. It's what connects you to me. We are connected through copper. And yet, the idea is that copper miner, whose children, 60% of whose children can't read in the copper belt region of Zambia, that copper miner doesn't need to be paid a good salary or a good wage because their standard of living is lower. They don't need so much money in Zambia. They just eat a little bit of, pap, some flour, an onion here and there, when they come up, give them something to entertain themselves. Maybe they get a cheap smartphone, some kind of knockoff smartphone. They watch a little video. They go to sleep in their house. They don't need air conditioning. They're not used to all this. That's the attitude. Why can't the Zambian miner be paid more? So their children go to school. So they have an existence where they have a proper cultural life. You have to keep their wages artificially suppressed by making a racist argument about culture. This is not just in Zambia. It's there in India. It's there in Malaysia. It's there across this belt of countries. Miners who go into the earth, workers who do things in the fields, peasants who grow crops and so on. They say, oh, you can keep the wages down. This is an old colonial idea that these people don't need the modern world. They can be kept in a low form of human civilization. It's a horribly offensive idea. But in a way, the whole structure of capitalism relies on these workers being paid these subpar wages. That's a colonial structure that gets reproduced generation after generation, even though these are nominally free countries. Zambia is a free country, it's not a colony, but its economy is kept in a colonial structure. Ghanaian Prime Minister, President Kwame Nkrumah called neocolonialism. It's neocolonial, the structure. So that's the colonial structure. Zambia will go and borrow money from the International Monetary Fund. Money apartheid. International Monetary Fund will say, we'll lend you money, okay, but you have to cut your healthcare system. You have to cut subsidies to education. That's why 60% of the children in the copper belt can't read. Because the government doesn't have the resources to have educational institutions. The IMF has told them, cut education, cut healthcare, cut pensions, cut all this stuff, privatize everything. See, that reproduces the colonial structure. How is the Zambian miner then going to lift their life experiences? How are they going to do that? They are not getting paid enough. Government is being told cut healthcare, cut education, all this. How are they going to do this? They can't. So generation after generation, the colonial structure is reproduced. This comes from a colonial mindset as well. That's what's important. There's also a mindset. The mindset that says, well, look, what do they know of civilization? That racist idea is there. They don't need to be paid much. So that structure and the ideology go hand in hand in a way, And you see, what's interesting is that like a country like China doesn't care about this. It has produced its own path. Now, some people can argue this is going back a long way, but that's not true. This is not about some old Chinese attitude towards the West or towards, it's not true. Your emperor told the British in the 19th century, we don't need anything from you. We've got everything here. And then the British forced opium on China, and China was humiliated. And the Chinese people became addicted to opium. Wages were kept suppressed and down. Western companies were doing to China what is continuing to be done in Africa today. It's not that China has a different history. It's the Chinese Revolution in 1949 that said, no, we are not going to accept neo-colonialism. We're not going to accept it. We're going to build our own agriculture. We're going to lift the standards of our own people. We're going to give them medical, education, all this stuff. So I don't agree with people who make the argument that China's advance is because of Chinese culture. That's nonsense to me. Where was Chinese culture in the 19th century when you were defeated in the Opium War? Where was Chinese culture when Hong Kong was taken? Where was Chinese culture when the foreign entities came and demanded extraterritorial protections in Shanghai? Where was it? It wasn't. It's really after the Chinese Revolution of 1949 that a new spirit is born in China. When Mao says, we stand up now, that's powerful. Look, countries around the world want to stand up. That's what I'm trying to say. What are you standing up against? When Mao says we are standing up, should ask, what are you standing up against? You're standing up against colonialism. You're saying no more opium war. You're saying no more humiliation. You see, that's the important aspect, that Mao is not just talking about standing up abstractly. He's talking about standing up concretely, standing up against colonialism. That's a very important question. If I may, I'll say it's afraid of neither. It's afraid of something else. So, the United States continues to have the world's largest military. Let's be clear about that. I know China has the military capacity to defend its borders, but the United States is a very dangerous military force. It can wipe out countries. Now, it can't tell people what to do. They destroyed Libya, destroyed Iraq, to some extent destroyed Afghanistan. Destroy countries, but you can't tell them what to do. People are not going to accept it, but you can still create terrible physical damage. China can have great damage inflicted on it if the US is crazy enough to go to war. Why is the United States so bothered by China? That's the question today, right? Nothing to do specifically with China, nothing to do specifically with socialism. Specifically, the immediate thing that they are bothered by is that the Chinese government and Chinese people made a bet about, let's say now, 40 some years ago. It's around your period of the reform in 1978. Chinese people made a bet. What the Chinese people bet was, the Chinese people said, okay, look at this. We've been able to improve the general condition of our people. We've improved the nutrition level. By 1978, nutrition levels went up from 1949. That was not that hard, because in 1949, because of the terrible war, nutrition levels were appalling. Agriculture had been destroyed in central China and so on. But they still lifted nutrition levels, lifted health levels, lifted education levels, lifted, in fact, what's very important is life expectancy. People in China were living longer and so on. Okay. Now, here's the bet. Look, they said, it's not enough in the modern world to feed people. It's not enough to have medical care and so on. We also need the best of science and technology, because a lot of advances are coming not through necessarily, redistributing the surplus that we have, taking the surplus and saying, let's put more into medical, let's put more into health. No, it's not just, socialism is not merely redistributing the surplus. We have to advance our science and technology. Why do I keep saying science and technology? You can't just improve your technology. Technology, in a sense, is yesterday's science. Science is tomorrow's technology. So you have to improve both science and technology side by side. So they said, let's do that. And from 1978, the Chinese government made some clever moves. For instance, when they said to the French um, solar energy companies, you can come and you can create factories in Shenzhen and other places. That's okay. But you have to tell us what is the science behind solar energy. We want to learn this. And the French said, because they were so excited by being given access to high quality Chinese labor. You see, labor is high quality because better fed, it's educated, right? It's not just for cheap wages. It's a wrong approach. If you want cheap wages, there are many countries to go to. What these companies wanted access to was, in a sense, the advantages of socialism. Better fed workers. If the workers are better fed, they can work with more concentration. They're not drifting off in hunger, and so on. So the companies were so excited by access to better, socialist workers that they said, okay, fine, here's the science. And then Chinese science poured over those advances, learnt everything super fast, and then began to innovate and develop their own scientific industry inside the country. By about 10 years ago, in 5 or 6 key areas, Chinese science was ahead of Western science. Chinese science had gone ahead in areas of telecommunications, in areas of robotics, in areas of green technology, and so on and so forth. High speed rail, for instance, a lot of different areas. These advances, particularly in telecommunications, are a direct threat to Western telecommunications companies. See, these companies rely on their monopoly to make profits. And because they are such important parts of Western capitalist countries, they're so important. If tomorrow the Chinese company like Huawei, ZTE, and so on wipe out Nokia, if they wipe out the American tech companies, these economies will go into serious crisis. So this whole Cold War business is actually a fight over whether China should be allowed to go ahead of the West in science and technology. That's really, in my opinion, that's the core of the fight. And the evidence I have for this is when Trump accelerated the pressure on China. When Trump accelerated this, see, Trump was a right wing Republican. You'd think that all the liberals would be opposed to the Cold War, the Democratic Party, and so on. You'd think they would say, hey, listen, Trump, what are you doing? This is crazy. No. Even the CEOs of the leading Silicon Valley firms, the CEO of Apple, for instance, he himself is a liberal personally. They give money to the Democratic Party. He went to see Trump during the high point of the pressure campaign on China, and all he said was, listen, go ahead with your pressure campaign because we want your help to defeat Huawei. You go ahead with the pressure campaign. Just make sure that Samsung in South Korea isn't getting too much of an advantage from this pressure campaign over Apple. While you're at destroying Huawei and ZTE, also destroy Samsung, because Apple and others, they must benefit. You see, Apple didn't go and see Mr. Trump and say, what are you doing? Our production lines are in China. With Foxconn, we produce all our phones in China. Stop this. No, he said, you accelerate the campaign. More important to destroy Huawei and ZTE and to take a short-term hit on production facilities than the long-term issue of having their advantages destroyed. So actually, in my opinion, the United States' obsession with China is an obsession to prevent China from fully standing up. In that sense, this is really a colonial situation. Because what they're saying to China is, we don't mind it if you are the producer of the world. If your workers produce everything, we don't mind that. But we don't want you to produce things for yourself. We don't want your companies to have an advantage over our companies. This is the colonial mindset. The one of the great tragedies of the socialist project has been that all socialist experiments have taken place in poor countries. None of the advanced capitalist countries advanced to socialism. None of them. Not Germany, not the United States, not the UK. None of them. The where was the socialist experiments? The Tsarist Empire, relatively poor, backward place. China, which, as you know, because of the long war, 1937 to 1949, war against the Japanese, civil war, and so on, was devastated. Socialism comes in Cuba, very poor country, colonial context and so on. You can't think of any socialist experiment that took place in a rich country. The closest thing we have is East Germany. But East Germany was destroyed by World War II. It wasn't the East Germany of the past, and so on. Because of that, we had to experiment. Marx had theorized that under capitalism, you build the productive forces, and then you just merely need to have a revolution and you socialize the means of production. What if there are no means of production? What if the productive forces are weak? What if you don't have factories, but you have poor peasants and so on? How are you going to build socialism there? We had the disaster of Cambodia, for instance. Disaster, where in Cambodia, what happened was they basically tried to socialize poverty. Everybody will be equally poor. That's not socialism. You see, my impression of socialism is that we want to abolish poverty. We don't want to generalize poverty. We want to abolish. How do you do that? You have to experiment. You have to build the productive forces. You have to maintain levels of equality, a socialist culture, and so on. For that, you have to do all kinds of interesting things. You have to, at some points, open up to various forms of private enterprise. Then you have to rein in private enterprise. Don't allow the people who run these companies to think they are, captains of industry. Nothing. You're just doing another job, my friend. You're building a company. That's just another job. Between you and the janitor is a difference of skills, a difference of experience, and so on. But don't think you're a better person than that person. That's a very bad attitude. When somebody says, oh, I'm a captain of industry, I built a big company, I'm better than a school teacher. That's not true, my friend. You are just two human beings doing two different tasks in the world. Admittedly, sometimes the captain of industry's tasks are more complicated. I understand that. I'm not a fool. I understand that you do more complicated things, you have a lot of pressure in your life and so on. But you're not a better person than a school teacher. You both play an important role in society. So we have to experiment with new ways because we are not building socialism in rich countries, we have to experiment in new ways. It's an illusion to believe, for instance, China is a rich country. China is a country rooted in the experiences of the global south. It faced the pressures of imperialism, terrible pressures in the 19th century, and you've just eradicated absolute poverty, which is a huge feat. But let's be frank, there were sections of China till last year that lived in the grip of poverty. It's hard to get out of it. So you have to experiment. Let's try this, let's try that. That's the attitude of socialism. Socialism is about using pragmatic mechanisms to advance the cause of humanity. It's not about being rigid, let's keep doing the same thing whether it's working or not. No, we have to be experimental, we have to be supple. I like the word supple. You have to, like a good yoga, your body has to not be all in the grip, like that. You have to be able to move in a way that's gentle, and if something is not working, try the opposite sometimes. Be open-minded, but make sure that you're along the path of advancing the cause of your people and of nature. Don't destroy nature. I learned that from Karl Marx. Marx said one of the terrible things about capitalism was a tendency to use nature as a free resource. But nature is not free. Nature is very expensive. It is the great gift that the planet has given us. We can't take advantage of it towards destroying it. I'm a great believer in having a balanced attitude towards nature. I don't want to live in a planet without trees and plants and birds. And I like nature a lot. I mean, it's not a question of like and aesthetics. It's a question of we rely on nature. Nature feeds us. Our labor goes and transforms nature into what we eat. So yes, we must experiment and so on, but keeping in line the idea of advancing the cause of humanity and maintaining a balance with nature.